Why didn't she run when the blast hit? At 03:47 in the morning, the explosion slammed into the field hospital like a giant fist. The trauma bay shook. Lights swung on their cables. Dust fell from the ceiling in slow, drifting sheets. Somewhere outside, metal screamed and men shouted. And Brooke Aldridge calmly set her coffee down. No flinch. No gasp. No startled step backward. She simply turned toward the sound. For 7 months, the men stationed at this forgotten forward operating base had known her as the contract nurse. Civilian, hazard pay, temporary, someone who would disappear at the end of the rotation and never be spoken of again. They were about to learn how wrong that assumption was. 6 months earlier, Brooke had stood alone in a one-bedroom apartment in Phoenix, folding the same 3 t-shirts into the same olive duffel she'd been packing since she was 18. The room looked borrowed, bare walls, no decorations, no evidence that anyone intended to stay. On the nightstand sat a single photograph, 6 women in body armor, dusty, smiling, arms slung over shoulders like they believed the world might let them keep each other forever. Only 5 of them were still alive. Beside the photo lay a black memorial bracelet, steel, cold, engraved with a name, a date, coordinates burned into memory. She slid it onto her wrist. It clicked softly against bone. It always did. She whispered to the empty room, "One more," and zipped the duffel closed. Brooke Aldridge was 38 years old. Her hair was pulled into a bun tight enough to survive rotor wash. Her hands were scarred and calloused, not from scalpels, but from years of gripping rifles and dragging weight through dirt that wanted you dead. She moved like someone who wasted nothing, not time, not energy, not emotion. She had grown up in a quiet Arizona town where nobody expected much, and she'd learned early that the military wasn't about glory. It was a way out. At 18, she became a Marine rifleman. Later, something rarer, a woman walking combat patrols where women weren't supposed to exist. She learned to fight quietly, to observe, to carry the wounded, to kneel in dust and promise things she prayed were true. She learned what it meant to lose someone who trusted you with their last breath. After 10 years, she left the uniform behind, took her discipline somewhere else: trauma nursing, emergency rooms, fluorescent lights, patients who never asked where. She learned to stay calm when blood hit the floor. But civilian life never fit. So when the call came, East Africa, counter-terror operations, forward medical support, she said yes before the recruiter finished the sentence. Now she worked night shift at a base that didn't officially exist. She slept in a container barely larger than a closet, ate alone, wore scrubs instead of camouflage, let the operators ignore her. She didn't correct them. Being underestimated had once saved her life. The young corpsman noticed first. Dylan Mercer, 22, first deployment, hands good enough to matter, fear close enough to be dangerous. She taught him quietly how to pack gauze, how to listen to a chest instead of watching a monitor, how to stay present when panic tried to pull you apart. The SEAL platoon leader noticed too, but not in a good way. Senior Chief Garrett Voss didn't trust contractors, especially not women in civilian clothes, especially not ones who didn't explain themselves. He questioned her decisions, cut her out of briefings, made sure everyone knew she didn't belong. Brooke absorbed it. She learned long ago that anger wasted energy, and wasted energy got people killed. Instead, she worked, she watched, she waited. The intelligence reports worsened, foot traffic closer to the wire, patterns tightening like a noose. She staged the trauma bay for a fight no one else believed was coming. 3 nights before the attack, a generator backfired. Brooke dropped low before she could stop herself. Someone saw. Nothing was said. The night before everything changed, she sat with Dylan and told him a story about a friend with steady hands and a calm voice. A friend who taught her that being there mattered more than any procedure. She didn't tell him the ending. At 03:47, the south wall came down. The explosion wasn't a sound, it was pressure. Dylan was thrown sideways, lights died, emergency red flooded the room. And Brooke Aldridge moved like the world had finally snapped back into focus. Her voice dropped. Her eyes went cold. Her body remembered who it was before anyone else did. She triaged, positioned cover, racked a sidearm she'd never officially carried. The wounded poured in. Blood, shrapnel, shock. Outside, rifles cracked closer. Then a Marine appeared in the doorway and said the words no medic ever wants to hear. "They're coming for this building." He handed her a rifle. She didn't hesitate, because she had never stopped being what she was. What followed wasn't chaos. It was discipline. Fire and movement, controlled breathing, medical hands turning surgical under fire, teaching while bullets struck steel inches away. She cut an airway open by headlamp, packed wounds, took shots, gave orders that saved lives. And when she keyed the radio, she didn't use a civilian name. She used the one she'd earned. The silence afterward wasn't confusion. It was recognition. The fight ended. The wounded lived. The truth surfaced slowly, not with celebration, but with recalculation. The nurse wasn't a nurse. She was the reason some men were alive at all. Later an apology came, not loud, not public, just honest. Respect followed, quietly, the way it always should. Months later, Brooke stood back in her apartment. 2 photos now, 2 bracelets on her wrists. She wasn't invisible anymore. And she hadn't needed to prove anything. Because dignity doesn't announce itself. It acts. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones nobody notices, until the moment everyone needs them. Why did no one ever ask her what she used to be? That question hovered over the base like dust in the heat, invisible but everywhere. Brooke Aldridge felt it every time someone walked past her without really seeing her. Every time a briefing ended without her name being spoken. Every time a SEAL operator nodded politely and then turned to someone else for answers she already had. She let it happen. There was a strange freedom in being overlooked. It gave her space to observe without being observed, to listen without being questioned, to prepare without drawing attention. She had learned long ago that survival often depended on the things people assumed about you, and right now they assumed she was harmless. The rhythm of the night shift settled into her bones. Midnight coffee, bitter, burnt, reliable. Rounds at 2, quiet murmurs, IV lines humming softly in the dark. Paperwork at 4, when the body begged for sleep and the mind refused to comply. She moved through the trauma bay like a ghost who knew exactly where every wall was. The equipment never shifted unless she moved it. The gauze was always where her hands expected it to be. The blood products were rotated and staged even when no one asked her to do it. Especially when no one asked. Dylan Mercer watched her the way new soldiers watch experienced ones when they don't yet know what questions to ask. He noticed how she never rushed, even when time mattered. How she never raised her voice, even when people were panicking. How her hands never hesitated, not even for a fraction of a second. One night while restocking supplies, he finally asked, "How do you always know what's coming next?" Brooke didn't look up. "Patterns," she said. "Bodies tell you stories before they fall apart, you just have to listen." That wasn't the answer he was expecting. He nodded anyway. She saw herself in him, too earnest, too willing, too determined to do everything right in a world that rarely rewarded that effort. It made her careful with him, protective without being obvious about it. She taught him how to pack gauze so it wouldn't snag, how to keep his elbows locked when applying pressure so his hands wouldn't shake, how to talk to patients like they were still people, not just problems to be solved. "You're not fixing machines," she told him once late in the shift. "You're borrowing time for someone who wants to live. Treat it that way." He wrote it down. Senior Chief Voss noticed too, but what he noticed made him angry. He watched Brooke from doorways and across rooms, his eyes calculating, suspicious. He didn't like that she spoke with quiet authority, didn't like that his corpsmen listened to her, didn't like that she never seemed impressed by him. He liked control, and Brooke Aldridge existed just outside of it. The confrontation came during a medical brief in front of half the platoon. He stood in the trauma bay like he owned it, arms crossed, voice hard. "My operators don't get treated by contractors," he said. "They get treated by my people." Brooke met his gaze without blinking, not challenging, not submissive, just steady. "Your people missed an arterial bleed last week," she said calmly. "I didn't." The room went still. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't insulted him. She had simply stated a fact, and facts, she knew, were harder to argue with than opinions. Voss left without responding. Afterward, Brooke stood alone at the stainless steel counter, her hands flat against the cool metal. Her pulse thudded in her fingertips. She wasn't angry. Anger took too much energy. She was something else. Tired. Tired of proving competence to people who had already decided she didn't belong. Tired of being measured against assumptions she never volunteered for. Tired of carrying a history that no one asked about but everyone judged anyway. She thought of her friend, the one whose bracelet clicked against her wrist every time she moved, the one who had smiled in that photograph like nothing could ever touch them. "They're going to underestimate us," her friend had once said, grinning through dust and exhaustion. "Let them, it makes everything easier." Brooke had learned how true that was. So she kept working. The intelligence reports grew darker. Words like elevated and credible started appearing more often. Brooke read them every morning unnoticed. She mapped patterns in her head, distances, timings, angles of approach. She started sleeping in the trauma bay. Dylan noticed. "You okay?" he asked one night. "You've been here all week." "Closer to the coffee," she said. He laughed she didn't. 3 nights before the attack, a generator backfired near the perimeter. A sharp crack split the quiet. Brooke was already moving before her mind caught up, dropping low, turning toward the sound, reaching for a weapon she didn't officially carry. She froze mid-motion, caught herself, stood slowly, brushing dust from her scrubs like nothing had happened. Someone had seen her. Nothing was said. But the air changed. The base felt like it was holding its breath, the kind of tension that pressed against your skin, subtle but relentless. Brooke staged the trauma bay without being told. Extra blood, extra gauze, chest seals within arm's reach. Equipment positioned for speed, not protocol. She ran Dylan through drills after midnight, framing it as practice but pushing him harder than usual. His hands shook at first. She corrected him gently, firmly. "Again," she said, "until your body does it without asking your brain for permission." The night before everything broke, she told him a story. Not the whole truth, just enough. "I had a friend once," she said, turning a suture packet over in her hands. "Best hands I ever saw, calm when things went bad, taught me the most important part of this job." "What's that?" Dylan asked. "Presence," Brooke said. "Being there, making someone feel less alone when everything hurts." "What happened to her?" Brooke was quiet long enough that the question almost dissolved into the hum of generators and the whisper of wind against metal walls. "She taught me that," Brooke said finally, "and then she was gone." Dylan didn't press. He could hear the weight in her voice, the kind that didn't want company. "How do you stay so calm?" he asked instead. "Doesn't it ever get to you?" "Every time," Brooke said. "I just got good at being scared quietly." Later that night, she stood outside the trauma bay, staring up at the stars. They were impossibly bright out here, unspoiled by city light. She touched the bracelet on her wrist. "I found another one," she whispered. "Young, good hands, reminds me of us." She remembered holding her friend in the dirt, the heat of blood, the way fear and acceptance could exist in the same breath. The promise she had made, the lie she had told a mother because sometimes mercy mattered more than truth. She didn't hear the footsteps behind her. "Can't sleep?" the Marine asked. She turned. He was broad-shouldered, quiet, eyes that scanned instinctively, the only other Marine on the base. He had been watching her for weeks, she realized. "You do that thing," he said. "What thing?" "The scanning," he replied. "Counting exits, watching corners. Contract nurses don't do that." She held his gaze. 3 seconds. Long enough for him to understand that whatever he was seeing, she wasn't going to explain it. "Good night," she said. She went inside. He stood there for a moment longer. Then he went to the armory and signed out a sidearm. He placed it in the bottom drawer of a supply cabinet in the trauma bay. They never spoke about it. The threat brief, the next morning, used the word imminent. Brooke didn't say "I told you so," she just prepared. When the blast came at 03:47, she was ready. And as the walls shook and the lights died and the world tilted into violence, the question that had followed her for months finally found its answer. Not in words. In action. Sometimes the past doesn't announce itself. It waits for the moment it's needed. What does a body remember when the lights go out? That was the question Brooke Aldridge didn't consciously ask herself when the blast hit at 03:47. She didn't have time for questions. The answer arrived on its own, carried by muscle memory older than fear. The trauma bay lurched sideways as if the ground itself had flinched. A pressure wave rolled through the container, rattling metal, throwing loose equipment against walls. For half a second, the world was nothing but noise and force and darkness. Then the emergency generator kicked in. Red light flooded the room. Dylan Mercer was on the floor, breath knocked out of him, ears ringing so hard he thought he'd gone deaf. Someone was shouting, or maybe that was the alarm, or maybe it was just inside his head. Brooke was already moving. It was unsettling to watch if you didn't know what you were seeing. There was no transition, no scramble, no spike of panic followed by forced control. One moment she had been a nurse reviewing a chart, the next she was something sharper, more focused, as if a lens had snapped into place. "Dylan." Her voice cut through everything, not loud, not frantic, precise. He looked up. "On your feet," she said. "Triage protocol now." His body obeyed before his thoughts caught up. He staggered upright, hands shaking, heart slamming against his ribs. Outside, automatic weapons fire cracked through the night. Not random, controlled bursts, close enough that Dylan could feel it in his teeth. "They breached the wall," someone shouted. Brooke didn't ask which wall. She moved the walking wounded first, putting steel and stacked crates between them and the entrance. She shoved carts into angles that created cover instead of clutter. She dragged the heaviest supply cabinet across the floor with a grunt that sounded almost annoyed. Her mind was already 5 steps ahead. When she opened the bottom drawer of the supply cabinet and pulled out the sidearm, Dylan's breath caught. He'd never seen her carry a weapon, never even imagined it. She checked the magazine, racked the slide, set it within arm's reach. No ceremony. The first casualty came through the door bleeding from half a dozen places, Hesco fragments embedded in skin and muscle. He was conscious, shocky, trying to joke through it the way operators did when they were scared. "Sit," Brooke said, guiding him onto the bed. "You're not as funny as you think you are." She worked fast, calm hands, eyes scanning color, movement, breathing. She didn't need monitors yet. She already knew where the real problem was. "Dylan," she said, "left arm, arterial bleed, tourniquet high and tight." He froze. For one awful second, everything he'd practiced vanished. Blood looked different when it wasn't simulated. louder, hotter, more final. "Look at me," Brooke said. He did. "Not the blood," she continued. "Me, you know this, do it." Something in her voice anchored him. He moved, tourniquet on, bleeding slowed. "Good," she said, already turning away. "Stay with him." More gunfire, closer now. Another operator came in supported by Chief Petty Officer Navarro, who was limping badly, his thigh soaked dark. He dropped to one knee but didn't let go of the man he was carrying until Brooke physically took the weight. She glanced at Navarro's leg, calculated, decided. "Dylan," she said. Navarro tourniquet left thigh. "I'm fine," Navarro grunted. She didn't even look at him. "He's not fine," she said. "Ignore him." Dylan did. Outside, someone was yelling for suppressive fire. A machine gun opened up, the deep rhythmic thump steady and reassuring in its violence. Then Staff Sergeant Omar Baptiste appeared in the doorway. He was in full kit, face streaked with dust and sweat, eyes sharp with recognition. He took in the scene in one glance, the wounded, the barricades, Brooke with a weapon at her side. "They're pushing this way," he said. 8 to 12 dismounts. They know this is the soft target." The words landed hard. The medical facility wasn't meant to be defended. It was meant to heal, and that made it vulnerable. Baptiste didn't ask if she could fight. He handed her his rifle. The exchange was silent, complete, one Marine to another. Brooke caught it, checked it, and nodded once. "Stay with the patients," she told Dylan, "no matter what you hear." Then she turned toward the door. The night outside was chaos, tracers stitched through darkness, shouts in a language she didn't need to understand to recognize intent. The attackers were moving fast, using the wadis and debris for cover. Brooke moved with Baptiste to a sandbagged position just south of the trauma bay. She took a knee, shouldered the rifle, and felt the old familiarity settle in. The weight, the balance, the calm. Contact at 2 o'clock. She fired controlled pairs. 2 shots, assess, adjust, no wasted movement. She called out distances and directions without raising her voice. Baptiste shifted fire instinctively, trusting her calls because they were always right. Rounds cracked overhead, slamming into metal. One sparked inches from her head. She didn't flinch. This wasn't bravery, it was memory. She fell back to the trauma bay twice, not retreating but transitioning. Once to open an airway on an operator whose throat was filling with blood. She performed the procedure by headlamp, hands steady despite rounds hitting the wall above her. Another time to repack Navarro's wound properly, coaching Dylan through another arterial bleed at the same time. "Pressure here," she said, guiding his hands. "Don't let go, this is your whole world right now." The radio crackled nonstop. Confusion, overlapping calls, then Baptiste keyed in. "Unknown station," he said calmly. "Identify." Brooke took the handset. For 7 months she had been careful with her words. Soft, civilian, forgettable. She wasn't careful now. "This is Anvil," she said. "Staff Sergeant Brooke Aldridge, United States Marine Corps. We have multiple surgical casualties. I need suppression on the south approach and medevac in 15 mics." The net went silent. Not static silence, human silence. The kind that happens when people hear something that forces them to rewrite their understanding of the situation. "Copy Anvil," came the reply finally. "Support inbound." The fight lasted minutes that felt like hours. Then the sound of rotor blades cut through the chaos. Attack helicopters tore into the approach, and the attackers broke, scattered, neutralized. When it was over, the quiet felt heavier than the noise had. Brooke set the rifle down, picked up a suture kit, pulled on clean gloves. She went back to work. Dylan stood in the corner, blood on his scrubs, tourniquet still in his hands, staring at her like the ground had shifted beneath his feet. He wasn't afraid anymore. He was in awe. Later, when the sun crept up over the horizon and the base gathered itself from the wreckage, the question that had hovered unspoken for months finally found its answer. Not in the firefight, but in what she did after. She didn't stand taller, didn't explain herself, didn't claim credit. She just kept working. Because sometimes who you are isn't revealed by what you survive. It's revealed by what you return to when the danger passes. And Brooke Aldridge returned to the wounded. Every time. Why does silence feel louder after the gunfire stops? The firefight ended the way most firefights did. Not with triumph, not with celebration, but with a sudden, ringing absence of sound that pressed against the ears and made the world feel wrong, as if something essential had been removed and no one quite knew how to breathe without it. In the trauma bay, the red emergency light still glowed, painting everything in the color of dried blood. The smell lingered, cordite, antiseptic, sweat, fear. Brooke Aldridge stood at the sink washing her hands, methodical, precise, as if this were any other night shift. Her hands didn't shake. Dylan Mercer noticed that before anything else. He was sitting on an overturned crate, helmetless now, his hair matted to his forehead. His scrubs were stiff with blood that wasn't his. His chest still felt tight, like he'd been holding his breath for an hour and only just realized it. He watched Brooke the way people watch storms after surviving them, half terrified, half reverent. She finished scrubbing, dried her hands, and stepped back to the table where Navarro lay. The chief was pale but stable now, his breathing even, pain-controlled. Brooke adjusted a line, checked a dressing, and nodded once, satisfied. "You did good," she said to Dylan without looking at him. The words landed harder than the explosion had. Because they were calm, ordinary, as if the last hour hadn't rewritten everything Dylan thought he knew about the woman standing 10 feet away from him. He swallowed. You were a Marine." Brooke paused for half a second, just long enough to acknowledge the truth without dramatizing it. "I was," she said. "I still am." That was all. Outside, the base was slowly coming back to life. Damage reports crackled over the radio. Engineers inspected the south wall. Security teams swept the perimeter again and again, chasing certainty they'd never fully find. At first light, the Tactical Operations Center filled. Every operator who had been able to walk made their way inside. Medical staff too, some with fresh bandages, some with eyes that looked older than they had the night before. Commander Taggart stood at the front of the room. She hadn't changed out of her surgical scrubs. There was dried blood on her sleeve she hadn't bothered to scrub away. Before anyone could start talking tactics, she spoke. "Before we break this down," she said, "there's something that needs to be addressed." She held up a thin folder. Brooke knew what it was the moment she saw it. Her file. The one she hadn't volunteered. The one she'd hoped would stay buried until the end of the deployment, when she could leave quietly without forcing anyone to reconcile who they thought she was with who she actually had been. The room was still. "Our contract trauma nurse coordinated the defense of the medical facility," Taggart said. "She treated multiple combat casualties under direct fire, performed an emergency airway procedure during the engagement, and coached a junior corpsman through his first live trauma while engaging hostile forces." A ripple of unease passed through the room. "Miss Aldridge," Taggart continued evenly, "is a former Marine Infantry Staff Sergeant." Brooke didn't look around. She stared at the table in front of her, the grain in the wood, the faint scratch someone had carved into it months ago out of boredom. "She served multiple combat deployments," Taggart said. "She was part of one of the earliest programs attaching women directly to infantry patrols. She earned commendations for valor. She also transitioned out of uniform, became a trauma nurse, and has been keeping your people alive for 7 months." The silence shifted. This wasn't the silence of shock anymore. It was recalibration. Senior Chief Voss sat in the back row. He hadn't spoken since the night before. His posture was rigid, hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles were pale. Operation names drifted through the debrief. One of them hit him like a physical blow. He remembered that night, the compound, the ambush, the intelligence that had been uncannily precise, the raid that had nearly gone wrong and somehow hadn't. The quiet work behind it. The work he'd never questioned. He realized all at once that the woman he had dismissed as a contractor had shaped the battlefield he'd fought on years earlier. That part of his career, his pride, rested on groundwork laid by someone he'd barely acknowledged. The realization didn't make him angry. It made him ashamed. The debrief continued, tactical details, timelines, lessons learned. Brooke didn't contribute unless asked. When she was asked, she spoke plainly, without embellishment, without ownership. When it ended, she stood and left. No speech, no pause. She went back to the trauma bay. Dylan followed her a few minutes later. He hovered in the doorway, unsure how to speak to her now. Every instinct told him she was the same person she'd been before the blast. Every emotion told him that wasn't entirely true. "Why didn't you tell us?" he asked finally. Brooke didn't stop what she was doing. She adjusted a monitor, checked a chart. "Because you didn't need the story," she said. "You needed the nurse." He frowned, but... "You trusted me before you knew," she interrupted gently. "That matters." She looked at him then, really looked at him. "You did your job last night," she said. "You stayed when it was loud. You kept your hands steady when it counted. That's who you are. Don't let anything else drown that out." His throat tightened. He nodded because he couldn't speak. The apology came later, quietly, the way it should have. Voss appeared in the trauma bay during the early morning hours, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He set one down across from Brooke and waited. "I lost a man," he said eventually, "because someone froze." Brooke nodded. "I know." "I put that on you," he said. "That wasn't fair." She didn't rush to absolve him. She didn't argue either. She let the words settle between them. "I don't need you to like me," she said. "Just trust the next person who doesn't look like you expect." He nodded. That was all he could offer. It was enough. In the weeks that followed, things changed in small ways. People said her name instead of her title. Someone hung a Marine Corps flag in the trauma bay without explanation. No one asked her to take it down. Meals were no longer eaten alone. Dylan stopped calling her ma'am and started calling her Brooke, though it took him a while to stop standing straighter when she walked into the room. Late at night, when the base settled into uneasy quiet, Brooke would sit alone and touch the bracelet on her wrist. "We're okay," she whispered. "We made it." For the first time in years, the words didn't feel like a lie. Sometimes belonging doesn't come from being seen all at once. Sometimes it comes from surviving together and choosing afterward to stay. And sometimes the loudest proof of who you are is the way the world grows quieter when you finally take your place in it. What happens after everyone finally sees you? That was the question Brooke Aldridge didn't know how to answer when the days after the attack began to blur together. The base settled into a strange, fragile calm, the kind that comes only after something terrible fails to finish the job. The south wall was rebuilt. Fresh HESCO barriers rose where broken ones had fallen. Engineers worked in the heat, their movements deliberate, careful, as if speed itself might tempt fate. Life resumed. But it wasn't the same life. Brooke felt it in the way people paused when she entered a room. Not hesitation, not fear, something quieter, consideration. The operators who had once walked past her now nodded. Some met her eyes. Some didn't know what to say at all, which was new. Respect had weight. It pressed on her in ways she hadn't expected. She had spent years learning how to carry invisibility, how to move without friction, how to be useful without being seen. Now there was nowhere to hide inside the role she'd built. The contract nurse was gone. What remained didn't fit neatly into anyone's expectations, including her own. Dylan noticed the change before anyone else. Not in her work. That was the same, precise, calm, uncompromising, but in the spaces between tasks, in the moments where silence used to feel comfortable. "You okay?" he asked one night as they restocked supplies. She considered lying. "I don't know yet," she said instead. He nodded. That answer made sense to him in a way it wouldn't have a week earlier. They worked side by side in companionable quiet. Dylan was steadier now. His hands no longer trembled when he anticipated blood. His eyes moved faster, scanning the room the way Brooks always had. She watched him and felt something loosen in her chest. Teaching had always been the part that mattered most. Outside the trauma bay, the base adjusted around her. The SEALs stopped referring to her as medical. They used her name. A few, after long days and worse coffee, started calling her Anvil. She told them to knock it off. They didn't. Voss kept his distance, not out of avoidance, out of respect. When their paths crossed, he nodded once, sharp, acknowledging, the nod of someone who understood the cost of being wrong and had decided to learn from it. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the scrubland gold, Brooke found herself sitting in the dining facility. Not in her corner. At a table. It started with one operator sitting down without asking, then another, then Dylan, then Baptiste, who said nothing at all and simply began eating as if this had always been the plan. Conversation flowed awkwardly at first. Stories about home, complaints about the food. Someone mentioned a dog back in the States and passed around a phone with photos that were too cheerful for the place they were in. Brooke laughed. The sound surprised her. It felt unfamiliar, like a muscle she hadn't used in years. Later that night, alone again in the trauma bay, she caught herself smiling at nothing. The realization sobered her. Joy, she knew, was dangerous if you didn't treat it carefully. It made you forget. It made you believe things lasted. She touched the bracelet on her wrist. "I remember," she whispered. Sleep came easier after that. Weeks passed. The intelligence reports eased. The base returned to its steady hum of watch rotations and routine vigilance. No one relaxed, but the edge dulled. One night Dylan froze mid-task. "Brooke," he said quietly, "what if I mess up next time?" She looked at him, really looked. The fear wasn't panic anymore. It was responsibility settling into place. "You will," she said. His face fell. "And you'll fix it," she continued. "Or someone else will. That's how this works. The goal isn't perfection, it's presence." He nodded slowly. "You were scared too," he said, not a question. "Yes," she said, "still am." He seemed relieved by that. The call came 3 months later. Rotation orders. Brooke read the message twice before it sank in. Her contract was ending early. Successful mission support, drawdown, redeployment. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt something close to grief. The night before she left, the trauma bay was quiet. Too quiet. She packed her duffel slowly, folding the same 3 shirts into the same careful squares. Baptiste found her there. He didn't speak at first, just handed her something small. A bracelet, paracord, scarlet and gold. "Made it myself," he said gruffly. "Didn't want you leaving with just one." She stared at it longer than she meant to. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, that was enough. Dylan hovered nearby, hands shoved into his pockets like he didn't quite know what to do with them. "You taught me everything," he said. She shook her head. "No, I showed you where to look, you did the rest." He swallowed. "I won't forget." "I know," she said. "That's why I taught you." The next morning she walked across the base with her duffel slung over her shoulder. The air was cool, the sky wide and impossibly blue. People she'd worked with stood nearby, pretending not to watch her go. Voss was there. He didn't speak, just nodded. She nodded back. No words were needed. Months later, she stood in her apartment in Phoenix again. Same walls, same shelf, same quiet. But something had changed. A new photograph sat on the nightstand. A group of tired people in front of a dusty medical container, alive, together, smiling despite themselves. She set it beside the old one. 2 bracelets rested on her wrists now. 2 lives, 2 families. Brooke Aldridge sat on the edge of the bed and let the silence settle. For the first time in a long time, it didn't feel empty. Sometimes the battle isn't surviving the fire. Sometimes it's learning how to live once the fire no longer needs you. And sometimes, strength isn't proven in the moment everyone watches. It's proven in what you carry forward quietly, into whatever comes next. What do you do when the noise finally fades? That was the question Brooke Aldridge sat with in the weeks after she came home, when the desert heat of East Africa was replaced by the dry, familiar stillness of Arizona mornings. No alarms, no generators humming through the night, no distant gunfire carried on the wind like a reminder that the world could break open at any moment. The silence felt wrong at first. She woke before dawn out of habit, heart already braced for something that wasn't there. She lay still, listening, counting breaths instead of exits. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it. Same bare walls, same shelf of books, same chair that had never really been sat in. The duffel rested against the wall, unpacked longer than it should have been. Brooke moved through her days carefully, as if the world might punish sudden motion. She went to the grocery store and felt overwhelmed by choice. She stood in line behind people arguing over coupons and felt a strange pressure build in her chest, not anger, not judgment, just the disorienting realization that this was what peace looked like for most people. She didn't tell anyone where she'd been. Not the cashier, not the neighbor who waved politely, not the old man down the hall who smelled like cigarettes and loneliness and always said good morning as if it mattered. At night she sat on the edge of her bed and held the 2 bracelets in her hands. One cold steel, one woven cord, 2 weights, 2 anchors. She slept better than she had in years. The dreams were still there, dust and pressure and voices she couldn't quite hear, but they no longer ended the same way. Sometimes now, when she turned around, someone was standing beside her. Silent, steady, not saving her, just there. It helped. She went back to work at a civilian hospital 3 weeks later. Trauma bay, same smells, same urgency, different rhythm. The first time a patient coded, her body reacted before her mind did. Calm settled in like it always had. Hands moved. Orders came out low and clear. Afterward, a younger nurse stared at her. "How are you so calm?" she asked. Brooke hesitated. "I've been scared longer than you," she said gently. The nurse laughed, unsure if it was a joke. Brooke didn't clarify. Weeks passed, then months. One afternoon, she received a message from an unfamiliar number. It was a photo. A young corpsman standing in a trauma bay halfway across the world, older somehow, steadier. He was smiling, but not too much, the way professionals smiled when they didn't want to tempt fate. Under the photo was a short message. "Got one in with a chest wound today. Didn't freeze. Did exactly what you taught me. Patient lived." Brooke stared at the screen for a long time. Her reply was simple. "Good hands, proud of you." She set the phone down and felt something loosen inside her, not pride exactly. Something quieter, something closer to peace. A few days later, she attended a small memorial service she hadn't planned on going to. No cameras, no speeches, just folding chairs, a flag, and people who understood the cost of being there. She stood in the back, hands clasped loosely in front of her, and listened to names being read aloud. Some she recognized, some she didn't. All of them mattered. Afterward, a woman approached her, younger, nervous. "Are you Brooke?" she asked. Brooke nodded. "My brother talked about you," the woman said. "Said you taught him how to stay calm, said you told him he wasn't alone." Brooke swallowed. "I'm glad," she said quietly. "He did the hard part." The woman hugged her without warning. Brooke stood stiffly at first, then she returned it. That night, back in her apartment, she took the old photograph from the nightstand. The one with 6 women in body armor, frozen in a moment that existed only because it was over. She didn't cry. She had done enough of that for a lifetime. Instead, she set the photo down and whispered, "We kept going." The months that followed were unremarkable in the way healing often was. No dramatic turning point, no grand declaration of closure, just small choices, showing up, teaching when asked, sitting with people who needed company more than advice. She volunteered to mentor new trauma nurses, didn't tell them her resume, didn't talk about deployments or medals or firefights. She taught them where to put their hands, how to speak when everything hurt, how to stay present when the world shook. One night, after a long shift, she sat in her car in the parking lot and realized she wasn't counting exits anymore. The thought startled her. She smiled. Not the rare, transforming smile from the photograph. Just a small one. At home, she placed both bracelets back on her wrists, not because she needed to, because she chose to. 2 families, 2 histories, 1 person still standing. Brooke Aldridge didn't think of herself as a hero. She never had. Heroes were loud. Heroes took credit. Heroes were easy to spot. She had learned something different. That strength could be quiet. That leadership didn't need permission. That the most important battles were often fought without witnesses, in moments where someone else needed you more than you needed recognition. She had been a Marine without a uniform, a nurse without needing validation, a teacher who passed on what mattered and let go of the rest. And if there was a lesson in her story, it wasn't about proving people wrong. It was about showing up anyway. Because the fire doesn't care who you used to be. It doesn't care what rank you held or what badge you wear now. It doesn't care about assumptions or appearances or titles. The fire asks only one thing. When everything shakes, when fear gets loud, when someone looks to you because they don't know what else to do, will your hands be steady? Brooke Aldridge's were. Not because she was fearless, but because she had learned how to be afraid quietly and still act. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. And sometimes the strongest people are the ones nobody notices. Until the moment everyone needs them.